I started Scotland Grows magazine because we really didn't have an offering in Scotland to cater for gardening in Scotland. Our climate is somewhat different to other parts of the UK, and while there are lots of great UK gardening magazines, all of the content is quite southern centric. So if you're growing and planting in Somerset, Cornwall or Devon, then it's great. But if you're in Scotland, we're slightly more moist, it's a little bit windier. Our conditions are different for gardening and for growing, and I wanted to bring something to market that would address that. So Scotland Grows is a digital magazine that comes out 6 times a year. We also have a podcast called The Scotland Grows Show, in which we interview lots of people gardening right across Scotland, and we find out their plant recommendations, what grows well where they are. We pick up lots of tips and lots of gardening stories along the way. And we've got a thriving social media community, a newsletter, a website. So there's lots of information on the website if you're gardening in Scotland. And we have a private Facebook group for all of our readers to come and share their successes and their failures. At the moment, it's not on the cards because one of the difficulties in getting a product out across Scotland is that we have a huge island community. And sometimes getting things out to our islands can be quite difficult. And I was very keen that when I started the magazine, that it wouldn't be postcode driven, so that everyone right across the length and breadth of this country receives a digital magazine at exactly the same time. And people gardening on our island communities don't have to wait 3 weeks till the boat comes in to get their copy. Podcast data is quite good as well, so I can track how many countries across the world the podcast has been listened to in. So last count, it was over 60 countries across the world, which is actually quite bizarre. The target audience for the Scotland Grows Show is Scottish gardeners, but we've charted top 10 or higher in not just in the UK, but in Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, America, all of which are English-speaking countries, so perhaps that's understandable. But more interestingly and probably surprisingly, the Scotland Grows Show has also charted quite high in the Apple Podcast charts in the Netherlands, Norway, Ukraine, surprisingly this week in Japan, and my favourite, we charted at #1 in the Apple Podcast charts in the United Arab Emirates. So it's huge thanks to the one person in the UAE who's interested in Scottish gardening banter. From the podcast, I don't think I could pick out favourite stories because that would imply I had favourite guests to the podcast. But what I would say is that we've had lots and lots of really, really interesting guests, and the range of guests goes from all of the presenters on Beechgrove Garden to head gardeners at places like Scone Palace to lots of the gardens and designed landscape managers from the National Trust for Scotland to readers' gardens to some of our columnists' gardens. And it's just a real diverse range. And what I love about the podcast is that you start a conversation with someone about a particular aspect of gardening, but then that leads on to talking about other aspects of gardening and why in their part of Scotland that particular plant might not work, might not grow, or has been a disaster for them, or what thrives really well where they are, so that I think listeners get a good sense right around the country of what might work where they are. So the first podcast I recorded for the Scotland Grows Show was with Brian Cunningham from Scone Palace. Brian's the head gardener at Scone Palace and also a presenter on Beechgrove Garden. I asked Brian deliberately if he would be my first guest because we do a lot of work together for the Scone Palace Garden Fair, and I thought it would be almost easier recording the first one with someone I knew and that I worked well with. But it's probably my least favourite episode, and that's got nothing to do with Brian. That's because I feel I sounded like a robot in the very first episode. Felt like I was firing questions at him and I wasn't really having a conversation. But I think when anyone starts a podcast, that's probably true until you relax into it and you realise that actually it's a conversation. You can go off script. You don't have to maybe stick to the questions that rigidly you thought in your head you would ask your guest. And you allow a little bit of space for the podcast just to move about and flow, yeah. So I'm going to re-interview Brian next year, or have him on the podcast next year, because we're going to run a series next year on the Scotland Grows Show called Scotland Grows Revisited. I'm going to invite back previous guests to the podcast to talk about maybe some of the things that we couldn't fit in the first time we interviewed them. So, for example, one of the gardens and design landscape managers from the National Trust for Scotland that I had on last year was absolutely great. Simon Jones. We talked a lot about National Trust gardens and about what happens when storm events happen across Scotland and those difficult decisions have to be made, that trees have to be felled. But interestingly, before he came to the National Trust for Scotland, Simon worked at Edinburgh Zoo, and he was responsible for sourcing the food sources of the pandas when the pandas came into Edinburgh. So he had to go off and source which type of bamboo would suit this type of panda and all of those. So it was really, really interesting. And I think opens up to people the fact that gardening as a career doesn't necessarily mean you're mowing lawns for the rest of your life. So lots of interesting conversations to come with previous guests about maybe little known stories and perhaps a few secrets.